Welcome back to Will It Work? Today we're looking at the C64 Mini. Comes with 64 games and a joystick. The company that released this, they made this mini one, and then people kind of said, "Hey, we'd like you to make a full-size Commodore 64," and they did. Modeled after the same thing, but really expensive. With a working keyboard and everything, and I think it costs new somewhere around $250 or something, and I think it was only available in the UK or Europe maybe. I think you can get them in the United States, but you know it's second buyer or something. I have seen them. They also made a VIC-20 which came out before the Commodore 64. If you're not familiar with the Commodore 64, it was a very popular home computer that sort of took over when everybody was buying home computers at the time. These little mini computers were various, companies released them. Radio Shack had the TRS-80 line. Apple, of course, had Apple II. You had, Osborne's, which I don't think many people had, although I did have a friend that had one. There were some Texas Instruments computers. There were a lot of different computers that were mini computers that were meant for the home. And it was the first time the computer was in the home. And they would sell them generally with the idea of like having the sort of the whole package, which was the computer keyboard part, a printer, some sort of storage. A lot of times in the beginning it was tape drive. ZX Spectrum, I think, mostly was always tape drive. It was very popular in England and parts of Europe, and as was Commodore 64. This also took cartridges, and so they gave you this idea that you would be doing some word processing at home. You could look at some business type applications on it, do some work, to get ahead. Kids could do homework on it, etc. But in reality, there's no internet, and there was no like real interconnectivity between like a Commodore 64 and the computer you would use at, say, the office, if you had a computer at your office. So the business side of these things, with these kinds of computers, there may be a little bit of stuff, a little bit, but not much. And while you could use it to type letters and print things out on a printer, people did do that. Kids did do that for homework, that kind of thing. I did it. The vast majority of these things were used by kids, and they would use them to get games and play games on them. Honestly, that was the main thing. Now, some people did little kits and little hobbies, and some people did music with them, and some people did like bulletin board systems. I did that. There was lots of people who learned how to do some programming, in BASIC on these sorts of things, and people wrote their own programs to do little things, but for the most part, it was a games machine. It really was. Now, I don't collect computers as part of as a game console. I think they're a computer, not a game console. They're just different. And if I were to go back and collect some computers, I would probably just collect some of these mini computers that I call them mini computers, that were out in the 80s, right? ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, Texas Instruments, TRS-80, maybe an Apple II. Because those generally were just used primarily to play video games, and there's a large selection of video games. But there's lots of emulators for those systems at this point. There's no real reason to collect them. I don't think collectors necessarily are looking for a lot of those original ones, especially they're more difficult to get a display out of and everything. So it's nice when a company like this puts together something like an emulator and makes it a little bit nostalgic rather than just giving you something generic. So this was sealed, but I'm going to open it because it came from the UK. I want to make sure it works properly and everything. So I will show you what it came with. So we get the basic Mini. This is just the unit. This keyboard is non-functional. It's just for display. None of these buttons work. It was not ergonomic at the time. But, you know, while that is true, with these Commodore keyboards, you had a full-sized, normal QWERTY keyboard. And I cannot tell you that most of the other computers I mentioned did not. They had chiclet-type rubber, you know, whatever was cheap. Putting in a full keyboard like this that would be durable and last for kids pounding on it, that was one of the big selling points. As well as the fact that the Commodore 64 sold extremely well because it was well-rounded. It had really good sound at the time. It was capable of, like, you know, it had a synthesizer chip in it. It was capable of doing something like 3 voices or something at the same time. Something like that. And it did 16 colors, and it had 64K of memory. And if you go back, a lot of these older computers only did 32K of memory. They didn't have sound, or their sound was like just a crappy speaker thing. Some of them may have had less colors. I think the early Apple IIs had less colors. They had to do a lot of dithering and things to make things work. These also had sprites. I think it was like 8 sprites on screen at once, etc. But you know, you could do lots of tricks to make things happen. And so the Commodore 64 also was like cheap because Commodore kind of drove the prices down, you know, to make this thing. They did develop their own microchips in their own facilities, which also saved money, and they were able to just kind of keep the price going down. So yeah, it outsold everything for the longest time. It was just such a big seller worldwide. Now in this case, instead of 9-pin joystick ports, we've got USB ports. So you can use a standard USB joystick if you have one. Now I will tell you that the original Commodore games, they used standard Atari joystick almost always. Now there were occasionally somebody would write something to use a 2-button joystick, but for the most part 1 button was always supported. But the keyboard was really necessary, and so I'm kind of hoping that I can plug in like a small keyboard to this with the joystick and be able to use that while we're checking out these games, because a lot of games will ask you to use keyboard for simple things like, you know, hitting spacebar to move past the menu or typing in your name, etc. Maybe they've emulated a lot of that with the joystick itself, but being able to plug in a keyboard would be great. So it looks like it's HDMI out, which is terrific, instead of composite, and we've got a micro USB for power. So no batteries, which also not unexpected. So let's look at the joystick. And this is sort of modeled after a joystick that was out at the time. This one is branded the C64, but I distinctly remember joysticks like this. I did not own one, but I had been over friends' houses that had Commodore 64s, and they had similar joysticks like this. It's just a generic style that was out, you know, maybe modeled after something. Usually, like I said, just the 1 button would be here. All these other additional buttons were nothing. You know, this is like a menu option. I can see there's 3 other buttons here. You know, you have a secondary button, but again, that wasn't there. Not even sure what those would be used for. It feels okay, right? But yeah, you could normally plug in a just a standard Atari 2600 joystick, which everybody had at that time, and continue to play Commodore 64 games. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I will plug it in, and we will see what we got on here, and see if we can play some of the games and see how good the emulation is. Alright, so we'll switch over to the video side and check it out. Here we go! Alright, we got the C64 Mini here, and I'm doing a voiceover again. I just wanted to disclaim that. Normally what happens is I record my audio while I'm playing the game, and or, you know, making sure the thing works, but I did that, but the computer that I used this on, you know, it didn't go. It didn't take my voice audio, but the video did. And the thing is that it's really quite an endeavor of time to hook everything back up and re-record everything, and it just seemed a little bit easier to do the voiceover on the video. There's like 5 systems I did this on, I think, so you're going to run into them as we progress here a little bit. This is like the second one, but it's all good. I mean, it is what it is. Commodore 64, I had a buddy who lived across the street from me when I was a kid, and he had a Commodore 64. And I used to go over to his house, and we would type in programs out of magazines and stuff. And or he'd show me new programs that his brother or something would get, like Blue Max or something cool. And that was kind of my introduction to the Commodore 64. We didn't have one in my house or anything. And then I had started working when I was about 15 and had earned an actually, that's not even, trying to even think back. I had one before that because I took one out to when I was living in California. Somehow, anyway, I had $300. I think that's what it was at the point. Like the Commodore 64 was about $150, and the disk drive that you needed was another $150. And I could use it on television, so I didn't need a screen. And so, hold on one second. So right now we're kind of looking at the menu for the C64 Mini, and it's nicely laid out. There's a nice selection of games that comes with this, 64 games, although not all of the best games, of course. That's probably the ones they could get licensed to, or ones that were maybe abandonware. I don't know the whole story with this system. I also don't know if you can add more games to it, although I'm sure, like everything, there's some hacks that you could do to expand it out. But the 64 that are here, at least, they got them all to work properly with the controls that you have. The only problem is that you really kind of need a keyboard with this thing. It's not so much like you're not going to have to type in the loading commands to get the games to work, but there are certain things, like, for instance, if we're going to show a demonstration of Temple of Abshine, and you had to switch between different modes of play with the function keys that were on the Commodore 64, and they do give you a sort of a pop-up keyboard that you can use with your joystick, which at least they gave that to you, and that's considerate, and it works. But you had to really kind of swap those things really quickly when playing a game like Temple of Abshine, so it really just helps to have a working keyboard. But otherwise, this is a nice little selection of 8-bit games. And, if you're a nostalgic type of game player and you don't know too much about the Commodore 64 because you played, like, say, Nintendo or whatever, and you didn't own one of these, the thing about the Commodore 64 is it ran on a 6502 microprocessor, and it had a synthesizer chip in it for audio. It could display 16 colors at once, and it had 8 sprites. So it was actually a fairly powerful little game system for being a computer, right? It had a lot of sort of video game-esque hardware in it, and it was very comparable to the Nintendo Entertainment System in the sense of they both could pretty much do the same games, and same resolution, the same processor speed, and for the most part, the same graphics. I don't know if the NES could display more than 16 colors at once, but I'm sure it had maybe a different palette and that sort of thing. There's lots of, like, really fine differences when you're looking at, like, the way graphics are drawn in different video games, etc. There's me getting killed by a rat because I can't figure out how to get the sword out because I forgot about the function keys when I was testing this. So I run away for a while. Then I get killed and I start again. But anyway, and but if you like playing old NES games or something, I certainly suggest you if you have an emulator or something, because you can find lots of Commodore 64 games online for free. There's some really good ones, especially some good RPGs, and it's worth your time to play some of them. Now, is it worth all of them? Not necessarily, but it's worth for some of them. And so it's a good time. It's a good time. It's same with like when you look at like Atari ST or Amiga computers that came in the 16-bit era, also very much, especially with the Amiga, very close to, say, Sega Genesis in terms of power. Same processor, same type of graphical display. But the one thing that was maybe a bit more unique about, I would say, both the Commodore 64 and the Amiga computer, and by extension maybe the Atari, is that these things were large. They had a large audience in the United Kingdom, as well as various parts of Europe, where video game consoles at that time didn't really permeate that market, right? So a lot of games that were written, good games, right, that were written for Commodore 64 and Amigas and such, were developed out of Great Britain and Europe, and this is your only way to play them. And they were made for an English audience. It was all written for English people, but there's fantastic video games written for that market, even when the American market started to drift away. Now, of course, with Commodore 64, it was a huge system. It was the #1 selling computer at that time. It had a lot of support, and they had everybody writing games for it. And Electronic Arts, was basically only on computers at that point. They didn't develop for consoles, etc. And so, all of the high-end best stuff came out on the Commodore 64. And then, by extension, people wanted to support the 16-bit era of computing. And but then, you know what happened. I mean, Super NES, Genesis, things started to shift more for consoles for a lot of game companies. It started to move back the other way. But I guess my only point is that if you haven't had an opportunity to play some of these old games, and any of them that might spark your interest, they're out there and they're free for the most part, and there's a lot of good ones. They're not all good, and a lot of the control schemes are certainly dated, but there's also ones that have a lot of depth and can be a lot of fun. So don't miss out on something that you can spend an afternoon or in a couple of weeks of playing some fun games that you just you didn't get a chance to play. So what we're looking at here is Temple of Abshine. This was early for Epix and Commodore, and it was a cartridge-based game. So it came on a cartridge, and I think eventually you could probably find it on disc like everything else. But it was sort of like an early kind of Zelda thing, right? You kind of went in a dungeon, you would sort of go exploring, you had, different weapons you would pick up, bow, short sword, long sword, that kind of thing. And you would run into different types of monsters, etc. And you could also search around for hidden rooms and collect treasure and cast spells and things. And it was pretty good for being like a live action type of thing. Now, graphically, it wasn't great. Like when it was originally written, this is what you're looking at, which is very blocky. But they actually rewrote it later on, and for the same systems and everything. But they improved the graphics. I think it was called like the Abshine trilogy, and I think I show a screenshot of it in here because it does come with the set. And because the Commodore 64 was capable of much better graphics than what you're seeing here, this is almost like BASIC. Like you would be able to like write games in BASIC, and you could use these sort of fixed graphics, right? That were like character sets, almost like from a key, like keys that you would type out. They would just, each key had a little picture underneath it that represented a different graphic that you could use as a sort of a static graphic, that instead of drawing like something with sprites and programming the raster and all this sort of stuff, you could use these things to construct some graphics. And that's pretty much what you're seeing here. These are sort of the dimensions and everything are kind of like that sort of fixed graphics thing, except for maybe the character and the snake there or whatever, or the dragon. But, so then it was eventually rewritten to actually just be more of a sprite-driven, raster-driven game that you would find, like, in most arcade games, etc. But it doesn't make it any less fun. It's actually a really fun title. So anyway, at some point I had $300, and I got a Commodore 64, and it took a long time. It's really kind of funny because, like, my dad didn't have a way to cash the check out. He didn't have enough money in his bank account to cash it, and Yeah, like he could have deposited into his bank account, but then he'd have to wait a while because it took a long time for checks to clear, and a lot longer than it does today. So he actually knew a guy at a liquor store, and that guy would sometimes cash checks for him. They would write down his name and address and give my dad some money. It's just how things were back then. And my dad got the cash, and then we went over to Sears, and we purchased the Commodore 64 and the disk drive, and I was a happy camper at that point. And I was too young at that point to have my own income because I just wasn't allowed to work. So I had I didn't have a lot of blank discs or anything. Don Cease actually bought me a 10-pack of discs at one point so we could get some more games. And I didn't have a modem or any of that stuff. It was mostly swapping with friends, etc. And then I had moved out to California the next year, lived with my mom, and she bought me my first modem, which was a 300 baud Westridge. It's really old school. It's basically like one of the slowest sort of auto dialer non-phone coupler modems you could get. Like the ones you see in like war games or something where he picks the phone up and puts it onto that coupler. That's even older than a Westridge, right? That was how they used to do it. And then you got the modem that just used the standard phone jacks. But most people, they weren't using 300 baud too much at that point. You would at least have been on 1200. It kind of went from 300 to 1200. And you get a 1200 baud, and then you were kind of fast enough because this wasn't web. Like we weren't doing like websites and high resolution graphics with those kinds of modems. It was more like this is Street Sports Baseball, and I was talking about this in the game here. With Street Sports Baseball, it was actually kind of a really good idea that I wish they would have adopted more, especially for like the football games that are out there, because with football, EA owns the NFL license. So if you're another game company and you want to make a good football game, can't, because Electronic Arts has the NFL license and you can't have it. Now you can make a college game if you want to get the college licenses, etc., but those don't sell that well. And I always thought, well, the street ball, the backyard ball game, that can be kind of fun. And these guys had this really neat idea back then. Like you would have all these different kids from the neighborhood, and you'd be picking teams. And there was like these little specs, and they all had different, highs and lows about how they played. And if you actually use that same thing today, like you'd have all these kids, and you could pick different people, or even like, it could be adults or whatever if you wanted to. This guy was a former NFL guy, but he drinks too much or something. You could do all kinds of fun stuff. And you could pick, like, who's on your team. The other guy picks who's on their team. And then you sort of assemble this team of, a mixed bag group of guys, right? And you're trying to win a football game with them. And I just think that would be kind of, that might be fun. And at the same time, you could still make a really good football game. You know what I mean? Like, it has a bit more of a narrative in it and all that. And you could make some interesting, like, it doesn't have to be big stadiums and stuff. It could be like, backyard lots or, New York street ball, or, you know what I'm saying? And there's potential there. So, they did that back then with the Street Sports series, and it was a good idea, So, here we're just kind of browsing through some more of the games, etc. And I'm going to look at like Pit Stop, which is like a pole position clone, and some other games. But yeah, so I got a modem, got involved in that, ran my first bulletin board systems with a 300 baud modem, which was ridiculous, and my mom didn't know what the hell was going on because we only had the one phone line, and I was running it at night. It was really early, man. I was like 14 years old trying to do stuff online. Nobody understood what the hell online even was back then. But then I eventually came back after a year and a half or so back to Ohio. Things didn't work out in California. I was living with my dad. And I ended up like just selling off the Commodore 64 and kind of swearing it off the computer thing for a while because I was just getting some attitude from my brother and my dad that I spent too much time on it and I should be out doing stuff. And I didn't really agree with them. Not the part about going out and doing stuff. I mean, it was more like I couldn't go out and do anything. I couldn't drive. I didn't have money. Where the fuck? I live in an apartment. Where the fuck was I going to go? So, anyway, I got rid of it, and I got a job, right? So I got a job, and Don and I talk about jobs and stuff on the last Oblast. But, I was working for a while, and then eventually, my grocery job, that kid that lived across the street with the Commodore 64, he started working at the grocery store too. Just about every friend I had worked at the grocery store where I had initially worked, and he decided that he was going to sell me his Commodore 64 because he was moving out of it too, and he gave me a really sweet deal on the whole kabang. Right, he had the monitor and the original Commodore 64 and disk drive and all his discs and all sorts of stuff, and he sold it to me really cheap, and it was a good friend. Yeah, so I bought it, again, and I kind of had that, for a while. It was a little nostalgia, missing out on some stuff, but, I had a faster modem now. I had a 1200 baud modem, and I also had money coming in, and, stuff was a lot cheaper because people had kind of been moving away from 8-bit and going to the Amigas and all that kind of stuff, 16-bit. So, I set up a more stable bulletin board system, got my own phone line put in, and ran that for a while, and then eventually upgraded that to 16, or no, to the Commodore 128, and yeah, so it was I'm gonna pause this. I tell you, I get text messages sometimes. People distracting me. But yeah, so I got a Commodore 128, ran a bulletin board on that, but it didn't really work very well. The guy that wrote it or something, I don't know. It was a weird combination of things with the Commodore 128 mode, and then they had a instead of the 5 1/4 inch floppy disk, they went to like the 3 1/5, which is the normal PC type floppy disks. At that time, Commodore had a drive for that offered a lot more space, and something was going on there with the way that software was written in that drive, where it didn't always function correctly, and the developer couldn't figure it out really, and didn't understand what the problem was with it, etc. And I certainly didn't. So I didn't have that bulletin board up very long because it didn't work very well. And another friend of mine ended up selling me like a Commodore Amiga, and yeah, and so I got that, and again, ran bulletin board systems, etc., straight up until the web started, and then eventually migrated over to the PC. So yeah, I have a long history with Commodore products, etc., until they basically went out of business. I had that CD32. It was like the last thing they released. And so yeah, very familiar with it, and a lot of great games, a lot of great gaming went on in my life, thanks to those systems and everything, and the fact that I could get things for free, via piracy, because I certainly couldn't afford to go buy them. I know piracy's wrong and all that kind of thing, but the reality was, I certainly did buy a large share of games, but when I had money, but you can't buy them all. You know what I mean? You just can't. And there's winners and losers. That you're going to be able to buy some, and you want to check out other ones. Otherwise, you'll never get to play them. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings on piracy. I get it. It costs companies money, etc. But then it's just like, when you look back on history, like now you can kind of go back and play everything. But back in those days, there wasn't like another way to get them. There wasn't like some rental service or some way to, get them cheap, or subscribe to a service that lets you play all of them. You either pirated them or you just never got to play them. And that was just kind of the way of things. And I think everybody universally knew it. It was just, if you were a game developer or company or something, you just kind of hoped that enough people would buy your game that it was profitable, you just had to sort of accept the fact that it would be pirated otherwise. And I'm not saying that's great, but I'm just saying that's how it was. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this one up. Commodore 64 Mini was okay. It's a decent system. I think it was, a little bit expensive for what it is, but you can't get it anymore anyway, so I mean, unless you buy it, you know, secondhand or something, or find one that's still new being sold somewhere. But you know, it comes with the big joystick and the little design system. It's all right. It's a keeper. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. A little later on.